in the gaslit streets of Victorian London, 1893, Whisper spoke of a doctor whose brilliance was rivaled only by his obsession. Dr. Victor Hawthorne, respected by peers and feared in equal measure, claimed to have unlocked a secret to eternal vitality, a method so unthinkable, so grotesque, that the medical establishment could neither condone nor fully comprehend it. He did not merely study blood. He replaced his own with that of others, believing that life itself could be stolen and stored, a transfusion of existence that would defy age and decay. Patients disappeared quietly, their absence excused by society as mundane ailments or relocation. Yet behind closed doors, the walls of his practice echoed with the faint, metallic scent of blood, and a chilling truth: Dr. Hawthorne's vitality came at a cost no one dared name aloud. This is the story of obsession, cruelty, and a legacy drenched in crimson. Victor Hawthorne's early years were marked by brilliance and a relentless fascination with the human body. Born in 1860 to a family of modest means in London, he displayed an uncanny intellect from a young age. By his teenage years, he had read widely on anatomy, physiology, and experimental medicine, often shocking teachers with both his knowledge and his morbid curiosity. While other children played in the fog-laden streets of East London, Hawthorne spent hours poring over cadavers in small, dimly lit rooms, taking meticulous notes, and questioning the very essence of life itself. By the time he entered medical school, Hawthorne's reputation as an innovative and meticulous student preceded him. Professors marveled at his precision in the dissecting theater, yet whispered concerns about his growing obsession with the concept of life's malleability. He believed the blood carried not merely oxygen or nutrients, but the very essence of vitality, a philosophy that would soon consume him. After graduating with distinction, Hawthorne established a private practice in a narrow, fog-choked street of London. On the surface, he was a diligent physician, known for his skill in complex procedures and his calm bedside manner. Yet the walls of his office concealed an experimental laboratory, cluttered with jars, syringes, and anatomical diagrams. There, Hawthorne began testing radical theories. If blood carried the essence of life, could replacing his own with the life force of others grant him immortality? The first volunteers were drawn from the city's fringes, orphans, the homeless, and those desperate enough to trust a man of science with promises of wealth, care, or relief from suffering. Records were scant, deaths easily excused as epidemics or accidents, and the public remained largely unaware of the experiments happening behind Hawthorne's locked doors. Colleagues began to whisper of the doctor's peculiar habits. He appeared unnaturally vigorous for his age, often working late into the night with a manic focus that defied exhaustion. Some speculated he had discovered a revolutionary medical procedure. Others sensed something far darker, but no one dared confront him directly. Hawthorne's obsession with vitality was growing, and soon, the city itself would feel the chilling consequences of a man who believed life could be transferred, stolen, and preserved in crimson. The stage was set. Dr. Hawthorne's fascination with blood would escalate from academic obsession to a macabre pursuit that defied morality, law, and the natural order itself. The first transfusion was both calculated and clandestine. In the winter of 1895, Victor Hawthorne selected a young man from the city's outskirts, a labor weakened by illness but deemed expendable in the doctor's cold, clinical view. The procedure was carried out in his hidden laboratory, far removed from prying eyes, with walls lined by jars filled with blood and shelves cluttered with instruments designed for precise extraction. Candlelight flickered against the brick walls, casting distorted shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the experiment itself. Hawthorne believed in meticulous preparation. He had studied every available text on transfusion, animal experimentation, and the emerging science of blood, yet he modified every step to suit his singular obsession, to replace his own blood with another's, infusing vitality into himself at the expense of another's life force. The laborer, unaware of the full scope of the procedure, was sedated under the guise of a medical necessity, his trust an unknowing contribution to the doctor's obsession. The transfusion began with precision. Hawthorne drew the man's blood into carefully sterilized glass reservoirs, monitoring his own body with instruments, measuring pulse, temperature, and color. As he injected the crimson liquid into his veins, he felt a surge, a fleeting sense of renewal, a warmth coursing through his body that seemed almost supernatural. The room smelled metallic, a scent that lingered long after the procedure ended, mingling with the faint tang of ether and antiseptic. Yet the cost was immediate and undeniable. The laborer, whose life had been quietly siphoned to sustain Hawthorne's obsession, did not survive the night. His disappearance was dismissed as another victim of London's harsh winters, a casualty of disease, poverty, or neglect. Hawthorne, however, recorded every detail with clinical precision, seeing in the death not tragedy but a necessary step toward what he believed was immortality. Word of his vitality began to spread subtly. Colleagues noted his unnatural vigor, his tireless work hours, and the sharpness of mind that seemed beyond human endurance. Yet no one could trace the source, and Hawthorne's experiments continued with increasing frequency and audacity. Each transfusion reinforced his belief that life could be borrowed, stolen, and extended, while the city unknowingly supplied him with the means to continue. The first transfusion marked a transformation, from brilliant doctor to macabre experimenter, a man who would replace not only his blood but, in the process, the lives of those around him, leaving a trail of death disguised as science. London in the late 1890s was a city of contrasts, gaslit streets bustling with commerce, fog rolling through narrow alleyways, and a populace vulnerable to disease, poverty, and desperation. It was the perfect environment for Dr. Victor Hawthorne's experiments. The city's overlooked, the sick, and the disenfranchised became unwitting participants in his quest for vitality. Deaths that might have been noticed elsewhere were here written off as influenza, typhoid, or the relentless grip of winter. Few questioned the strange vigor of one man while countless others succumbed quietly in the shadows. Hawthorne's office, situated inconspicuously along a narrow thoroughfare, masked the horrors inside. Passers-by admired the neat facade and the discreet brass sign, unaware that behind the polished door lay glass reservoirs of blood, antiseptic fumes, and the faint, metallic scent of life drained from the city's poorest. Inside, Hawthorne worked methodically, alternating between consultation with paying patients and nocturnal experiments on the vulnerable. Every transfusion brought him a sense of invincibility, yet left a silent trail of disappearance and death. The doctor's notoriety, though growing, was subtle. Some of his colleagues whispered about his unaging appearance, the sharpness of his mind, and the peculiar emptiness in the records of his practice's patients. Others noticed the faint metallic smell that sometimes emanated from his office, though no one dared to investigate. The public, however, remained largely oblivious, distracted by the ceaseless pace of the city and the constant presence of illness, crime, and mortality. Hawthorne became both part of the city's fabric and an invisible predator within it. He cultivated a persona of benevolence, often offering free medical aid to the destitute, which not only deflected suspicion but also provided a ready supply of those whose blood he could harvest. London's poverty-stricken and desperate did not question the intentions of a man who appeared so learned, so kind, so concerned with human welfare. Even as the city thrived, unknowingly nourishing his obsession, Hawthorne's experiments escalated. He grew meticulous in recording physiological changes in himself, claiming he could detect vitality, vigor, even intellect transferred from donor to recipient. The doctor's obsession was no longer theoretical, it was lived experience, and yet entirely dependent on the obliviousness of those around him. London, vibrant and unaware, continued its daily life, blind to the fact that one man's unnatural obsession had turned the city into both laboratory and graveyard. Hawthorne's macabre experiments marched forward, unchecked, in the shadows of civilization. Hawthorne's laboratory was a room of contradictions, meticulous order within a chamber of horror. Tucked behind the facade of his respectable practice, it was accessible only through a narrow staircase descending into the cellar. The walls, lined with dark-stained shelving, held rows of glass jars filled with preserved specimens, syringes glinting in dim lamplight, and meticulously labeled containers of blood. The air carried the iron tang of life itself, mingled with the faint antiseptic odor that he used to mask the true nature of his work. Within this chamber, Hawthorne devoted himself entirely to the manipulation of blood. Each experiment was a ritual, performed with precision, obsession, and a chilling reverence. Donors, the poor, the ill, or the socially invisible, were selected carefully. Hawthorne monitored their vitals, recording every heartbeat, pulse, and tremor, ensuring the process would maximize his own vitality while minimizing the donor's survival. Yet, he accepted mortality as inevitable collateral, convinced that life could be redistributed, borrowed, and preserved. The procedures were gruesome in their efficiency. Tubes and reservoirs funneled crimson liquid from one body to another. Hawthorne maintained careful notes, measuring not only the quantity of blood but the subtle essences he believed traveled with it: warmth, vigor, and, in his mind, the spark of intelligence. The faint groans of sedated subjects echoed faintly through the stone walls, yet he regarded them as instruments of discovery rather than victims. Each transfusion reinforced his sense of invincibility. He seemed to age slower, think sharper, and withstand fatigue that would cripple an ordinary man. The secrecy of the laboratory was paramount. Hawthorne ensured that few could witness its horrors. Couriers, apprentices, and the occasional unwitting patient never remained long enough to grasp the full extent of his obsession. He maintained the illusion of a respectable medical practice above ground, performing legitimate procedures, administering remedies, and gaining trust, all while siphoning vitality in the shadows. Colleagues occasionally noticed anomalies: his unending energy, his seemingly miraculous recoveries from illness, or the metallic scent faintly trailing him in the streets. But London's pace, its fog, and the social hierarchies that silenced suspicion kept his experiments concealed. In the secret laboratory, Hawthorne was both god and executioner, wielding life and death as though mere substances in a scientific equation, indifferent to morality, law, or humanity. It was here, in the dim candlelight and the scent of iron, that Victor Hawthorne perfected his macabre art, a man attempting to conquer mortality, unaware that the city's blood he consumed would one day bear consequences far beyond his calculations. For every transfusion Victor Hawthorne performed, there was a victim whose life was quietly extinguished. The poor, the sick, and the desperate became his unwitting contributors, drawn to the promise of medical aid, comfort, or employment. Few questioned the doctor, for his reputation as a skilled and compassionate physician provided cover for the horrors that transpired beneath the floorboards of his respectable practice. Victims were chosen meticulously. Hawthorne observed them for vitality, mental acuity, and physical resilience, as though selecting ingredients for a precise recipe. Those who failed to meet his stringent criteria were quietly dismissed, their absence unnoticed in the teeming city. Those deemed suitable were sedated under the guise of treatment, monitored as their blood was extracted and replaced with saline or transfusions intended solely to sustain Hawthorne. The process left them weakened, often fatally so, but in his obsessive mind, their sacrifice was justified by the extension of his own life. The streets of London, foggy and unrelenting, concealed these disappearances. Families, struggling with poverty and illness, often assumed their loved ones had succumbed to disease or misfortune. Hawthorne's meticulous records provided plausible medical explanations for those who survived, while the dead vanished into statistical obscurity. No coroner questioned the rising number of unexplained deaths in certain districts, for the city itself seemed to accept mortality as inevitable. Witnesses occasionally whispered about the doctor's strange practices. Servants noticed jars of blood on shelves, apprentices detected the metallic scent lingering in the laboratory, and patients remarked on Hawthorne's unnatural vigor. Yet fear, reverence, and disbelief kept them silent. His victims, voiceless and anonymous, remained shadows in his obsession, their existence reduced to a means of sustaining his life. Hawthorne justified every death with a cold, scientific logic. Vitality could be transferred, life could be borrowed, and mortality was a variable in the pursuit of greatness. Yet even he could not fully account for the moral rot that permeated his experiments. The blood he consumed carried not only life but the weight of conscience, and the city's ignorance allowed this darkness to flourish. Unchecked, as the number of victims grew, so too did Hawthorne's audacity. He no longer operated merely as a curious physician. He had become a predator, a man reshaping his very existence with the stolen essence of others, and London remained blissfully unaware of the crimson trail he left behind. By 1897, the metallic tang of blood that clung to Hawthorne's laboratory began to draw subtle attention. Neighbors whispered of a faint, persistent scent that drifted from his practice, a scent unlike any medicine or ointment. Street vendors spoke of it in passing, children recoiled when passing the alleyway, and a few perceptive apprentices hesitated at the laboratory door, feeling the air thicken with something unnatural. Yet curiosity, fear, and the doctor's formidable reputation kept these murmurs safely confined to shadows. Within the laboratory, Hawthorne remained oblivious or indifferent to such rumors. His obsession with vitality had intensified. Each transfusion was measured, recorded, and analyzed with increasing sophistication, as though he sought not merely life but perfection. He experimented with different donors, varying ages and conditions, meticulously observing the physical and mental changes within himself. Every beat of his enhanced heart seemed proof that his methods were working, while the growing weight of his secret accumulated in tandem with his vitality. Even as whispers circulated, London's official structures remained blind. Coroners noted some anomalies, yet causes of death could be explained by disease, frailty, or urban hardship. Families accepted the loss of sons and daughters with resignation, unaware that their absence had sustained a man's unnatural longevity. Hawthorne manipulated both perception and records with precision, ensuring that his trail of victims remained invisible to the legal and medical establishments. But subtle cracks began to appear. Apprentices, uneasy with the scent and the secrecy, began to speak in hushed tones to each other, and a few parishioners expressed faint unease at the doctor's ceaseless energy and an aging appearance. Hawthorne, ever confident in his mastery, dismissed these concerns as ignorance or superstition. Yet each whispered observation represented the beginning of scrutiny, a small but persistent thread threatening to unravel decades of concealment. In this tension, the scent of blood outside, the whisper of suspicion within, the first seeds of discovery had taken root. Hawthorne's macabre experiments, once invisible, would soon begin to draw the eyes of those unwilling to ignore the unnatural, and the shadows of his obsession teetered on the edge of exposure. By 1898, Dr. Victor Hawthorne's obsession had become audacious, and with audacity came exposure. The faint whispers of neighbors and apprentices had begun to coalesce into more direct scrutiny. A junior assistant, tasked with preparing the instruments and monitoring the transfusions, had begun asking questions Hawthorne dismissed with veiled threats and sharp reprimands. Yet doubt had been planted, and human curiosity, once aroused, proved difficult to suppress. One night, a minor accident nearly exposed the operation. A donor, sedated but unusually strong, awoke mid-procedure, struggling against the restraints. The metallic scent of blood, so familiar to Hawthorne, now drew the attention of a nearby passerby, who noticed the faintly flickering light in the cellar window and the muffled sounds emanating from below. Panic and chaos ensued within the laboratory. Hawthorne managed to subdue the man and restore silence, but the encounter marked the first real risk of discovery. Fear flickered in his mind, a sensation long suppressed by obsession and calculation. Hawthorne's meticulous records, once a source of pride, became a potential liability. Each entry in his journals, detailing donors, procedures, and physiological observations, was evidence of crimes that were, by any measure, indefensible. He began hiding them in more secure locations, layering deception atop obsession. Yet every precaution underscored the fragile nature of his secret. One mistake could unravel decades of clandestine work. The city, meanwhile, began to stir with vague unease. Reports of unexplained deaths, though scattered, were increasingly noticed by local authorities and medical examiners. The missing poor, once accepted as casualties of harsh urban life, began to draw scrutiny, particularly when patterns emerged. Sudden disappearances clustered around the areas Hawthorne frequented. Though no one yet connected these events to him directly, the pressure was mounting. Despite these risks, Hawthorne's obsession remained unyielding. Each transfusion reinforced his sense of invincibility, even as danger crept closer. He rationalized the near misses as tests from Providence, trials that confirmed the righteousness of his pursuit. Yet in the quiet moments, the doctor could sense that the shadows were closing in, that every victim, every stolen drop of life, edged him nearer to exposure. Hawthorne's confidence, once absolute, now teetered on the brink. The city's watchful eyes, the whispers of his assistants, and the fragile veil of secrecy would soon collide with the dark truth, heralding consequences that the doctor had long believed impossible. In the spring of 1899, suspicion finally pierced the fog of secrecy that had long shielded Dr. Victor Hawthorne. A series of unexplained deaths among the city's marginalized population, young laborers, itinerant workers, and the chronically ill, caught the attention of a vigilant coroner and a small network of concerned physicians. Though each death had been attributed to illness or urban hardship, patterns emerged. All had received brief visits from Hawthorne, and in every case, the disappearance coincided with periods when the doctor claimed to be occupied with urgent experiments or consultations. Hawthorne's meticulous control over his practice, once sufficient to hide the truth, began to unravel, Curious apprentices, emboldened by minor inconsistencies in his explanations, began comparing notes. They observed discrepancies between his recorded procedures and patient outcomes, noting that some recoveries were merely illusions, sustained by deception and omission. Faint rumors of the metallic smell drifting from his laboratory began to reach the authorities, corroborated by the accounts of street vendors, neighbors, and even local constables who patrolled the fog-laden alleys. The first official inquiry was discreet. Authorities sent an inspector under the guise of routine review. He arrived at Hawthorne's office, noting the unusual structure of the basement, the peculiar organization of medical supplies, and, most alarmingly, the faint, persistent odor of blood. Hawthorne, ever composed, provided carefully staged demonstrations of standard medical procedures, charming the inspector and downplaying any concern. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. As word of investigation spread quietly among medical peers, a few brave colleagues began pressuring authorities to dig deeper. They cited anomalies in death records, unexplained absences of patients, and rumors of grotesque experimentation. Letters were sent to the coroner, detailing suspicions that were, until now, confined to whispers. For the first time, Hawthorne faced the possibility that his decades of concealment and manipulation could fail. Despite the growing scrutiny, Hawthorne's obsession remained unwavering. He intensified his experiments, justifying the risks as necessary to perfect his method. Yet the tension was palpable. Every transfusion, every interaction with a potential donor now carried the weight of impending discovery. The doctor's brilliance and audacity had brought him to the precipice of exposure. The investigation had begun in earnest, and the walls of Hawthorne's hidden laboratory, once impregnable, now trembled under the pressure of scrutiny. London's blood-soaked secret was poised to be revealed, and the consequences for the man who had dared to play with life itself would be irreversible. By late 1899, the authorities had amassed enough suspicion to confront Dr. Victor Hawthorne directly. A small contingent of inspectors, accompanied by a few trusted physicians, arrived at his practice under the guise of a routine review, but their purpose was far graver. Hawthorne, who had long operated with calculated confidence, sensed immediately that the veil of secrecy he had relied upon for years was thinning. The air in his office seemed heavier. The familiar metallic scent of blood now mingled with tension and fear. The confrontation began politely, with inquiries into patient records and unusual practices. Hawthorne answered with charm, detailing routine procedures and dismissing any concerns as misunderstandings or clerical errors. Yet the inspectors were prepared. Subtle inconsistencies in his logs, corroborated by witness accounts, pointed to patterns impossible to explain without acknowledging foul play. Hawthorne's composure, while impressive, was no match for the mounting evidence arrayed before him. When asked directly about the disappearance of certain patients, Hawthorne faltered. The first cracks in his practiced demeanor appeared as his mind raced, calculating how much he could deny without revealing the truth. Yet the intensity of the questioning, the relentless pressure, and the corroborating testimonies forced a horrifying admission. With a mixture of pride and resignation, he confessed to his transfusions, the extraction of blood from victims to prolong his own life. He described procedures, victims, and methods with clinical detachment, revealing decades of obsession and experimentation. The confession shocked the assembled officials. The meticulous record-keeping, the calculated cruelty, and the sheer audacity of Hawthorne's actions rendered disbelief impossible. Witnesses who had feared the doctor were vindicated. Those who had whispered rumors now faced the grim reality that the horror they had sensed in shadows was horrifyingly true. Yet even in confession, Hawthorne framed his actions as a pursuit of scientific advancement and personal perfection, a chilling reflection of the mind that had rationalized murder as research. He spoke of vitality, life's essence, and the moral imperative he imagined in his pursuit, failing to recognize the human cost of his obsession. The confrontation concluded with the doctor's arrest, the laboratory seized, and the city confronted with a macabre truth. A brilliant physician had used London itself as a reservoir of life, replacing his own blood with the stolen vitality of countless victims. Hawthorne's confession sealed a legacy that would haunt the city, and the question lingered, how many lives had been sacrificed in the name of obsession? The trial of Dr. Victor Hawthorne began in the spring of 1900, drawing crowds from across London and attracting the scrutiny of the nation's press. Courtrooms, often reserved for high-profile criminal cases, were packed with curious citizens, medical professionals, and families haunted by the disappearances of the poor and vulnerable. The city, long unaware of the horrors occurring in its midst, now confronted the shocking reality of a man who had manipulated life itself in pursuit of immortality. Hawthorne's defense was as calculated as his experiments. He claimed scientific curiosity, innovation, and the pursuit of progress as justification. He argued that the blood transfusions, while unconventional, were conducted with medical precision and no malicious intent, a grotesque distortion of ethics that both fascinated and repelled the jury. Yet, the overwhelming evidence, testimonies from survivors, apprentices, neighbors, and detailed records of his procedures, left little room for doubt. Prosecutors emphasized the human cost. They recounted the victims' disappearances, the manipulation of the poor and desperate, and the cold, clinical manner in which Hawthorne had treated life as a consumable resource. Each story of a missing laborer, an orphan, or a destitute patient painted the portrait of a man whose intellect had been warped into obsession and cruelty. The courtroom often fell silent, the weight of the testimony hanging like a pall over all present. Experts in medicine testified to the dangers and impossibility of the methods Hawthorne had employed. Even by the standards of experimental medicine, his procedures were unnatural, illegal, and morally indefensible. The jury, confronted with both scientific opinion and vivid human testimony, grappled with the enormity of Hawthorne's actions, a man who had weaponized science against life itself. Public reaction to the trial was immediate and intense. Newspapers ran sensationalized accounts, while salons and lecture halls debated the moral implications of the case. London, previously naive to the dangers of unregulated obsession, now had a cautionary tale that would linger for decades. Hawthorne's name became synonymous with scientific hubris, cruelty, and the dark extremes of human ambition. In the end, Dr. Victor Hawthorne was convicted on multiple counts of murder and manslaughter. His infamy cemented a legacy that extended far beyond the courtroom, a chilling reminder that brilliance, when untethered from conscience, could become monstrous, and that life itself, when manipulated, could become the most terrifying instrument of obsession. Even after Dr. Victor Hawthorne was sentenced, the city of London could not rid itself of the shadow he had cast. His trial concluded, his laboratory sealed, and his experiments exposed, yet the echoes of his actions lingered in the fog-choked streets, in whispered conversations, and in the fearful imagination of a population now keenly aware of the fragile line between brilliance and monstrosity. Hawthorne's victims, though nameless to many, became the city's silent testament. Families who had long accepted disappearances as inevitable in a harsh metropolis now mourned with a clarity sharpened by knowledge of the doctor's crimes. Orphans, the poor, and the marginalized had been exploited in the most intimate of ways, their very blood drained to fuel one man's obsession. London itself seemed to carry the memory of this violence, a collective unease that permeated neighborhoods, alleyways, and households. Medical institutions instituted reforms in the wake of Hawthorne's exposure. Procedures that once relied solely on trust were now subject to rigorous oversight, ethical review, and transparency. His case became mandatory reading in medical schools, a stark illustration of the dangers of unbridled curiosity divorced from morality. Yet even these lessons could not erase the visceral horror of his deeds, nor the knowledge that science, in the wrong hands, could become a weapon against humanity. Hawthorne himself faded from public life, confined to prison, where the man who had sought immortality faced the inescapable reality of mortality. Letters and journal entries, smuggled from his cell, revealed a man still obsessed with vitality, still rationalizing his crimes, and still detached from the human cost of his pursuit. Even in confinement, his mind remained locked in the labyrinth of his experiments, a chilling reminder that the obsession with life can endure even when the body is restrained. Abandoned laboratories, dusty journals, and the metallic scent that once haunted the air of his practice became artifacts of a grim lesson. Genius without conscience can corrode the soul and consume the lives of others. Scholars and investigators would revisit his case for decades, examining the techniques, motives, and consequences, yet the human toll remained beyond calculation. The haunting legacy of Dr. Victor Hawthorne is not only the stolen vitality of countless victims but the moral tremor that reached through London streets, a chilling testament that obsession, when fused with intellect and secrecy, can render a man a monster, and that the shadows of such acts linger long after the perpetrator is gone. London remembered, and it shuddered,